modern day guitar heroes. I think growing up, when guitar music was a little more popular and a little more mainstream, it was easier to pick out who the guitar heroes of the generation were. Obviously, I think growing up for both of us, and even though he was before our time, Jimi Hendrix was somebody who everybody would talk about as a guitar hero. But I think today, because guitar is not as prominent in popular music, I think the question is a little harder to answer. So, Willie, today, who are the most influential guitar players of today, specifically in the blues rock genre in your mind?
I think it is a different question in today's market. And I think the market plays a big part in it because listeners and players, they're going to have a different list of who they think the heroes are. And that's because of exactly what you said. It's not as popular as it once was, at least commercially. Certainly the players and the real fans, they love it just as much as they ever had, if not more. So I think when we talk about listeners, we're talking about a name, a Jack White, Gary Clark Jr. I think we could even, on a lesser degree, talk about a Warren Haynes popularity-wise. I think Derek Trucks in that same echelon as Warren. After that, it starts to diverge. I think then there's certainly, for the guitar players, there's a ton of people. We spoke about Eric Gales last week. I know that there are a lot of people that think he is the quintessential guitar player, and he is definitely right up near the top for anyone who knows the genre. I think we're going to find other names that are less known to people. I think we could even put in, I know this is a wild card, but I think the Lovell sisters at times have some wonderful riffs, and I'm talking about Lark and Poe. Pete, I think at this point we're talking maybe more of the people who don't get as much notoriety. Who are some of these guys, some of these men and women that you think are the heroes?
Well, I think when you're talking about blues rock, I think you got to mention Joe Bonamassa right off the bat. Because even when you look at a guy like Joe, even though he's so well known in guitar circles or to people who like blues rock music, he's still not necessarily a mainstream name that's going to get recognized everywhere he goes when he walks down the street.
Right.
But I think over the past decade, as far as the blues rock thing goes, I think Joe is definitely as influential as anybody. I think there's tons of people out there who are emulating Joe on YouTube. I think his reach goes all over the world, and he's influencing guitar players all over the world. So I think you definitely have to mention a guy like Joe. You mentioned Gary Clark Jr.
Sure.
I think he's one of the most mainstream guys as far as blues rock goes. And what's great about Gary is he appeals to pretty much all ages. And he can play so many different styles. And I think that's part of his appeal and how he can bring so many people in and influence so many people is because he can play blues, he can play rock, he can play funk, he's soul, hip hop, R&B. He can do all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think one thing about Gary too, is he kind of has that hip factor about him, that cool factor. And I think sometimes there's some stereotypes around blues that maybe it's just your dad's music and it's, an older generation and it's not for young people. Well, I think Gary kind of brings those young people in and shows that the blues can be cool. So I think Gary Clark Jr. is definitely super influential. You got to mention a guy like Kenny Wayne Shepherd. He's right there at the top. You mentioned Eric Gales as far as modern day players. I think you got to throw in a guy like John Mayer, obviously. With his mainstream success and appeal.
Yes.
I think as far as guitar players and popular music, he's one of the few guys out there that can still play guitar and put guitar on his records. Right. So I think he's definitely worth mentioning. And then you got to mention a guy like Philip Sayce. He's right up there at the top today with some of the best guitar players on the planet. There are very few guys out there that play with his passion and energy. I think Philip Sayce is great. You look at a guy like Dan Patlansky from South Africa. Sure. Who's a two-time winner of Blues Rock Review's Album of the Year. He's a phenomenal player, not as well known outside of South Africa. He's kind of breaking into the European market, not super well known here in the States, but I think he's a great player. And I think what's interesting is you kind of have the current Mount Rushmore of guys as far as blues rock, and they're all kind of in that same age range. They're all kind of early, mid-40s. And I think that's kind of where the top guys are. But then you've got the younger guys as well, like Marcus King.
Right.
I would throw Kingfish in there, Eric Steckel, Ryan McGarvey. Those are really talented guitar players as well. So it's a really interesting question because, yeah, I think these are different times. And while there are some phenomenal guitar players out there today, they're just not as well known as they would have been 20 or 30 years ago.
You're right. The age demographic has shifted for who tends to be at the top. I'm not so sure why that is. Maybe part of it is the aging listener demographic. So I think that's correct. I also want to throw in a couple names there that I think are great. I thought Ryan Perry, first album on his own, Hard Times, was wonderful. Really great, a gritty sound. Throws in some great guitar lines, maybe not as much flash, but a wonderful voice to match. His guitar is incredible. King Solomon Hicks, a very young man. He's probably about 22 now. If there's someone who reminds me of the traditional B.B. King style blues, just wonderfully inventive, crisp, great playing. There's a lot of young guys, but you're right, Pete. The age has skewed over for who we put on that proverbial Rushmore.
Well, and there's a lot of guys that are just super underrated too. Alan Nimmo from King.
Sure.
Simon McBride is another guy who's super underrated. You know, Anthony Gomes is a great player as well. So yeah, yes. There's just so many, but I think that Mount Rushmore is kind of that age group in that 40s age range right now, where you got your Bonamassas, your Kenny Wayne Shepherds, Derek Trucks, Eric Gales, Philip Sace. Like those guys, I think right now are kind of the guys that are really influencing that next generation.
I agree.